This week, I want to show you hands-on how to shoot the perfect time lapse. So let's go back and do all of that again, but I'm tired as hell. So let's do sunset this time. All right, so before we head out, let's talk about the gear that we're gonna be taking to use to shoot this time lapse, starting out with the camera. It's not that important which camera you use to shoot a time lapse, but every single camera has a slightly different time lapse feature, so it's important to know what you're working with. If your camera's built-in time lapse mode isn't very good, you might have to use one of these. This is called an intervalometer. It's basically an attachment for your camera that tells it to take photos at certain intervals, like take a photo every 2 seconds. Different cameras also have different intervalometer inputs, so it's important to make sure you get the right one to match with your camera. Then, lens choice. I'm usually shooting wide for time lapses just to get the whole landscape, and I think if you're not sure exactly how you're gonna shoot, that's a good place to start and a good thing to go with. But it can also be really cool to shoot with the telephoto lens and zoom in and get like a very focused part of the landscape and really center in and compress that area and see exactly what's going on in that specific area. So really up to you, but if it's your first time lapse, I'd recommend going wide. Then an ND filter to go on the lens. And this is something that you don't necessarily need for a time lapse, and I'm actually not gonna be using to shoot my time lapses, but it can be cool for getting certain effects in a time lapse. Like if you wanna control the shutter speed and have, the shutter speed be very slow and show like motion blur of people walking around or water moving, that's where this can come in handy. But today, we're not gonna be using it. And finally, a tripod. Yeah, this one's pretty self-explanatory. Another important thing to be aware of before you actually go out to shoot is weather. Weather conditions are super important for time lapses, more than for pretty much anything else that you're gonna shoot. Perfectly clear conditions with absolutely no clouds aren't gonna give you much of a time lapse during the day because you won't see those clouds moving. But having a perfectly clear sky with no clouds is also exactly what you want for shooting a time lapse of the night sky and seeing the stars. So it really depends on exactly what you're shooting. Partly cloudy weather is basically the old reliable for shooting a time lapse because you're gonna get those clouds moving throughout the image, but they're not gonna completely cover the sky. So it's good for like sunsets or really just any kind of daytime time lapse where you want to see the clouds moving. But I would also tell you to never rule out stormy weather for a time lapse. Many of my favorite time lapses I've shot have been taken right after a storm or a really rainy day because you can get some crazy cloud conditions and lighting right after a storm. The clouds are like unmatched. They just do really cool stuff and have a lot of motion. So if you look at the weather and you see that it's probably gonna be like a rainy day, I wouldn't necessarily rule out going out and shooting a time lapse anyway. But no matter what, just be aware of what you're gonna be shooting in and what to expect. In addition to keeping an eye on the weather, take some time to research the location that you're shooting. Usually with landscapes, we're talking about this big, wide, expansive area and this large composition. So you need to understand what you want the subject to be, what angle you want to shoot it from, and what spot you're going to have to hike to get it from that angle. I use a smartphone app called PhotoPills that basically uses augmented reality to let you see where the sun is going to rise and set, where the Milky Way is going to be at certain times of day from a particular area. It's really cool and really helpful, especially for time lapses. I'll leave a link to that in the description, but I've already done all that research, so we can go ahead and start hiking to this spot. That's a bear canister to put food in, and bear spray to have on you while you're hiking. Two very good things to have with you if you're hiking somewhere like North Carolina where there are a lot of bears. But while we hike out to to the cliffs, I want to talk to you about a few best practices for shooting time lapses, and particularly what not to do. So what I'll sometimes see people do is basically just set up their shot, hit record, and record like a 20-minute long video. And that is the cardinal sin of shooting a time lapse. I guess it's a little more convenient at that moment when you're shooting, but it takes longer to edit, and the result you get looks a lot worse, and also restricts you to the video limit of your camera, usually 20 or 30 minutes, which is not that long for a time lapse. Instead, to do a time lapse, you should always shoot photos at intervals. So instead of recording a video, you have your camera take a photo every 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever, but there are a lot of benefits to that. You can record for a much longer time while still usually having a smaller file size in the end, and it's also a much better file to work with. It's a lot more detailed, you just get a cleaner image, and you have a lot more control over it in post. Also, this little area by the trail is like absolutely covered in moss and ferns, which is great. I love ferns. I need to get some ferns for my room. This is just a little notch off to the side of the trail. This isn't even the view, but it's sick though. Quite the view. This isn't the view though. We're going over there. So, back on the trail. Part of the trail, just slicing, chopping right through that rock. Sick. Nothing but views out here. So now that we've made sure you're shooting still images for your time lapse, go ahead and make sure that they're raw photos and not JPEGs. I know a lot of you are going to be like, hell no, no way I'm going to fill up my SD card with 3,000 raw images, but I promise you it's worth it. It's the difference between this time lapse and this time lapse. JPEG, raw. JPEG, raw. Shooting in a raw image format gives you that extra flexibility that you need for something like a time lapse, because you're shooting over an interval of maybe several hours, even possibly more than a full day. So things change a lot. Lighting changes, white balance changes, and you need the flexibility to adjust it in post to what's right. That could mean bringing more detail out of a blown out sky, or raising up the shadows to capture all that nighttime detail of the stars. And if you shoot those 3,000 raw images and then your time lapse just sucks, you can just format your card and pretend it never happened. But I promise you it's worth it to shoot in a raw format so you have that flexibility to get the best shot possible. Also, isn't this campsite cool? I'm coming backpacking here in a few weeks. We might have to camp out here. Sick view, huh? The temperature on this trail, astronomical. It is way too hot. Seriously though, it's hot and humid as hell out here. The mountains are supposed to be cold. We're gonna trudge on though, make it up to the top. Wait until you see this view. So you've made it and you're ready to set up and shoot your time lapse. But there's one very important step first, and that's to take a minute and take in the sick view. I'll give you 30 seconds. Time's up. All right, now let's talk setting up the shot. First, composition. It's important to have a subject for a time lapse because it gives you something to focus on in a frame that's going to be usually filled pretty much with moving elements. In my case, that's going to be this guy right here, this little peak that stands out in the background of the shot. Furthermore, because of the structure of this ridge, we're going to have these leading lines leading up to that subject, which will give the viewer something to guide them to that point in the frame. I'll also use photo pills to set up the composition because I want to know where the sun and the stars are going to be when that information is necessary. I'm not going to be staying here long enough to see the stars, but I could see exactly where the sun is going to set. In this case, I can use my eyes and deduce that the sun is going to be setting over there. All right, so let's talk camera settings. I would try and go for a nice neutral exposure to start with. If you blow out the sky, you're not going to be able to see the clouds moving, which kind of defeats the whole point of a time lapse in most cases. But if you completely crush the shadows and only have the sky exposed properly, you're going to have like a weird silhouette effect, and you might as well just point your camera up to the sky. You can make sure you get a nice even exposure and don't lose the highlights or the shadows by looking at the light meter on your camera's LCD. You should have a little bar at the bottom of your camera screen that has some numbers on it, usually from -2 or -3 up to +2 or +3. So just try and get that at 0, and that's a nice even exposure. If it's on 2, then you're going to be too bright and losing the detail in the highlights, and if it's on -2, you're going to be too dark and losing detail in the shadows. It's also probable that your exposure will change throughout the duration of your shot, so you need to know the 3 different modes that you can use to set exposure throughout the time lapse: manual, shutter priority, and aperture priority. If you're in fully manual mode, then the exposure won't change at all from shot to shot. It's going to stay completely consistent, which isn't good for most time lapses, but there are a few kind of special situations where you might use it. Like if you want to have both the shutter speed be very slow and the aperture be very wide open, then you could use an ND filter and use that to adjust the exposure, but that's a very rare case. So for most time lapses, you're going to want to use either shutter priority or aperture priority so that your camera adjusts the exposure to keep it consistent throughout the shot. In shutter priority, your camera is going to keep the shutter speed completely consistent and adjust the aperture and sometimes ISO to keep the exposure consistent. The issue with that is that you can only change the aperture so much. There's quite a limit to it. It might stop if you're using an f1.4 lens, then your aperture, once it gets to f1.4, it's not going to go any lower. So if you're shooting maybe a sunset and it gets dark enough that your camera's all the way down to 1.4 and it needs to brighten the shot, it's going to start bumping up that ISO, introducing grain into the image. That's why for time lapses, you generally want to go with aperture priority. This way it keeps the aperture consistent and adjusts the shutter speed throughout the shot to compensate for change in exposure and keep it consistent. And what's good about that is that your shutter speed can basically go either way almost infinitely. It can go all the way from like a full 60-second long shutter up to like 1/5000th of a second. You have a lot of range. You can go from very bright to very dark, and your camera is going to be able to maintain that exposure throughout the shot without changing the ISO at all. There are some cases where that change in shutter speed could be a bit of an issue in your shot. For example, in this time lapse I shot in New York City, you can see that as it gets darker, the shutter speed lowers and the water gets a lot smoother. But in most cases, this is perfectly fine, and it definitely beats having a grainy time lapse. Also, I'm like shooting this A-roll for the tutorial right now, talking about camera settings, and I'm like on a cliff. Like one slide and I'm done. Should probably go shoot the next part somewhere else. So this is my go-to time-lapse camera. It's the Panasonic Lumix G7. This camera actually stays in my camera bag in addition to this main camera, the Canon EOS R, because its time-lapse mode is so good. You can do everything in camera. You just set the interval, the shutter speed, how many photos you want to take. It's perfect. This camera, on the other hand, despite costing 4 times as much as this Lumix G7, has a terrible built-in time-lapse mode. The shutter speed is really limited. The intervals that you can shoot at is really limited. It's just not good in most cases. So that's why you have to use this little guy, an intervalometer, which basically tells your camera to take X number of photos at any given interval between the photos. You can do some other stuff with it too, like you can tell your camera to start shooting at a certain time. Like if you don't want to start yet, you can say start shooting in 2 hours and it'll do that. But we're just going to be focusing on the interval and the number of shots today. So have a look at your camera's built-in time-lapse mode, see if it sucks, and if it does, then see if you'll need one of these. And if you get an intervalometer, make sure you get the right one for your camera, because different cameras have different inputs for these. So you don't want to get one that won't work. Like this one for Canon won't work on this Panasonic camera. So let's start out by setting the interval. So we're just going to navigate over to interval at the top, press set, then navigate over and set the number of seconds. If you want to set over a full minute, you can set 1 minute right there, but we're just going to use the seconds. I'm going to go with 4 seconds for this particular time lapse. Then just hit set to lock that interval in, then move over 1 to the right to the number of shots, and I would just set this to infinity. Most of the time that's going to be fine. I mean, in some cases you might want to take specifically 400 photos to save like space on your SD card, but most of the time you can just set it to infinity and turn the camera off when you're done shooting the time lapse. Then when you're ready, just hit that power button again 1 time and it'll start shooting at intervals. Really easy, nifty little device to use. I'm sure it looks sick on camera, but there's no way you can see how massive this is in person. It's wild. And now, time to get to editing. File organization is the first step and it's pretty important for editing time lapses. As you can see here, I've got one folder that has all the stuff for my time lapse in it and nothing else. If we open up that folder, we can see I've separated out the RAWs from the JPEGs. Now you don't have to shoot JPEGs. I shoot both RAW and JPEG for each photo, so I have that smaller JPEG preview. You don't have to set your camera up to do that. That's just what I prefer to do. You can just shoot the RAWs. I'm also gonna create a third folder in here and just call it processed. That way, once we edit this time lapse in Lightroom, we can store all of the processed, fixed up photos in this folder for when we import them into Premiere. The most important thing is just that you've got a folder with your time lapse in it and nothing else. It's just gonna make your life a whole lot easier once we get into Lightroom and Premiere. Now I'm just gonna open up Lightroom and hit Command-Shift-I to import the photos for our time lapse. Just navigate to that folder that has all your raw photos in it, select them all and hit Import. Then wait. Really quick, while we're importing these photos, I just wanna specify that this crazy vignette that you might notice around the edge of the photos is from the lens. That's because I'm using a crop lens on a full frame setup, so just don't mind that. Just ignore it. All right, so now that we've imported all 1,489 photos for this time lapse, we can start to edit these. Just looking at this, we can see that I exposed for the sky to keep as much detail as I could in the sky. So I'm gonna start by bringing up the shadows to bring some of that detail out. And then we can see it's still pretty dark, so I'm gonna bring the exposure up just to get it back to where it should be. And then finally, we've lost a bit of detail in the sky by doing that, so I'm gonna bring the highlights back down. Finally, looking at the sun, we've got this weird purple effect in the white part of the sun, so I'm just gonna go bring the whites up to fix that just a bit while keeping that detail in most of the highlights. And as we can see, we've brought back a lot of detail in this image. Then I'm just gonna adjust the white balance. Usually I just go with auto. Lightroom is pretty good about figuring out the white balance that an image should be, so you can almost always just rely on that. Another thing I'll usually do is a little bit of noise reduction, because with a time lapse you can tend to see a bit of grain in the shadows, especially if you're exposing for a long time and kind of letting that grain pile up throughout that several second exposure. So I'm just gonna go in, noise reduce just a little bit so we can get rid of some of that grain. I like how this frame looks, but we do have to keep in mind that since this is a time lapse, there's a tendency for things to change throughout the clip. So the last frame is probably gonna look pretty different from this one. So how do we make sure that this is gonna look good on both the first frame and the last frame and everything in between? Well, I'm just gonna right click on this first frame, go to develop settings, and then copy our settings. And then I'm gonna go to the very last frame of the time lapse, select it, and then paste them onto that frame. As you can see, it looks good here as well. So I'm just gonna go ahead and select all the photos in here, right click, go to develop settings and hit paste settings. And that's gonna paste that configuration that we made at the beginning onto everything. So I didn't have to on this particular clip, but what I would normally do if there was a lot of difference from the first frame to the last is paste those settings onto the last one, adjust, then paste them back onto the first, adjust, and go back and forth until I get something that works for both. There is a program you can use called LR Timelapse that'll allow you to dive in even deeper and kind of change these settings throughout the shot, but frankly, I have no idea how to use it, and I didn't want to go quite that hard for this tutorial, and instead show you something that all of you can do to get a close enough effect that's still going to be a really good time lapse in almost every single case. But if you're doing something crazy, like shooting like a multiple day time lapse or something, that could be something worth looking into. Also, pasting these settings onto everything in Lightroom takes like a really long time. Like you might as well just go out and shoot another time lapse while you wait. Finally, once we're done, we're just gonna hit Command A once again to select everything, then hit Command Shift E to export all of these. For the export location, we're gonna choose that processed folder that we made earlier so that we can have all of these in their own folder for when we import them into Premiere. Then under file naming, you are gonna want to rename all of these and give them a sequential name just so that we can import them into Premiere later on. So I'm gonna hit rename, then use some custom text, just call it time lapse, doesn't really matter. Then just click export and it's gonna export all those images sequentially into that processed folder so that we can easily bring them into Premiere and finish editing our time lapse. Now let's open up Premiere. I'm just gonna create a new project, call it screen recording. Sorry to break the fourth wall a little bit, but that's what this is. And then to import our time lapse, I'm just gonna double click in the media bin and navigate to that processed folder that we saved our time lapse in. But these are JPEG images. How do we import these into Premiere as a video? Well, we're just gonna click on the first one in the folder, hit options, and then check off image sequence and hit import, and it's gonna import those images each as one frame in a video. Now you can finally just watch your time lapse and enjoy it. Be proud of yourself and what you created. This is a good part of the process. And you're done. Now you've imported that into Premiere and you can edit it as if it were any other clip in Premiere. Finally, one plugin that I do occasionally use on time lapses is called Flicker Free, which basically just removes that subtle flicker that you can sometimes get when you're shooting a time lapse. I rarely ever use it, but sometimes it can come in handy. Like for this shot, I had like a pretty noticeable flicker throughout the shot, so I used Flicker Free and it smoothed that out, but it's definitely an optional part of the process that you won't usually have to deal with. But we've officially reached the end of this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed this one, learned something new from it, and if you did, and you do go out and shoot a time lapse of your own and use it in one of your own videos or post it on Instagram or whatever, tag me in it. I'd love to see it. I love seeing you guys using these techniques in your own work and taking something away from these videos and actually applying it and practicing it. So I'd love to see that. But if you enjoyed this one, feel free to show your support by leaving a like on the video, sharing it with your friends, or even subscribing to my channel. I upload new videos just like this every single week at the moment. But that's all for this week. Keep creating and I'll see you in the next one. My time lapse is still exporting.